Back to another exciting installment of The Last Years of Merlin by T.A. Barron. This is chapter 19 called Honey. Last chapter, Emrys agreed to go with Rhea, and she told him about a guy named Stangmar who has the evil castle and is evil. So, chapter 19, Honey. As swiftly as the stag, Rhea bounded off. Although my legs still felt stiff, I tried my best to keep up with her through dense thickets and over moss-banked streams. Even so, she often needed to stop and wait for me. Because the sun rode high above us, sending shafts of light to the forest floor, I could see obstacles much more easily than the night before. Even so, I stumbled often enough that Trouble finally took off from my shoulder. He stayed close by, flying from branch to branch. And while my shoulder felt grateful for the rest, I did not resent his watchful eye as I had only a while ago. Animals of all kinds were on the move. Birds with small gray bodies or bright green wings or huge yellow bills, traveling sometimes in flocks and other times alone, flew overhead. Large-eyed squirrels, beavers, a doe with its fawn, and a golden snake also passed me. In the distance, wolves howled. At one point, an enormous shape, black as night, ambled out of the trees. I froze, fearful, until two smaller shapes appeared just behind, and I knew that I had encountered a family of bears. All these creatures shared the same look of fear I had seen in the stag, and all of them, it seemed, were heading in the opposite direction from Rhea and myself. Late in the morning, perspiration dripping from my brow, I stepped into a shadowed glade. Cedars, very old from the looks of them, stood arranged in a perfect circle. So shaggy was their bark that at first glance they might have been mistaken for an assembly of ancient men whose long manes and beards flowed down over their stooped bodies. Even the sound of their gently stirring branches seemed different from the whispers of the other trees, more like people at a funeral, humming a solemn, mournful lament. Then I noticed, in the center of the glade, a narrow earthen mound, no wider than my body. It stretched at least twice my own height and length. It was surrounded by round, polished stones which glistened like blue ice. Cautiously, I moved closer. Trouble flew back to my shoulder, but instead of perching himself as usual, he paced back and forth with sharp, agitated steps. I caught my breath. I have been here before. The notion, the conviction, came to me in a fleeting instant, like a scent of some flower that appears and then vanishes before you have time to find its source. Some dim memory touched me briefly and then fled. Perhaps it was only a dream, or the memory of a dream. Yet I could not shake the feeling that, in some way I could not quite identify, this mound within the circle of cedars was familiar. "Emrys, come on!" Rhea's call jarred me back to the present. With a final glance at the mound and the mournful cedars, I left the glade. Soon I could hear the strange humming no more, but it continued to haunt the darkest corners of my mind. The terrain grew steadily wetter. Frogs piped and bellowed so loudly that sometimes I could not hear my own breathing. Herons, cranes, and other water birds called to one another in eerie, echoing voices. The air began to reek of things rotting. At last I saw Rhea, standing by the tall grass at the edge of a dark swath of land, a swamp. Impatiently she beckoned. "Let's go!" I viewed the swamp skeptically. "We have to cross that?" "It's the quickest way." "Are you sure?" "No, but we are running out of time. Did you see all the animals fleeing? And if it works, it could save us an hour or more. Just on the other side of the swamp are the hills of the Grandalusa." She turned across the swamp, but I caught her arm. "Just what is the Grandalusa?" She shook loose. "I don't really know. Her true identity is a secret, even to Arbassa. All I know is that the legends say she lives among the living stones of the Misted Hills, that she knows things no one else knows, including some things that haven't happened yet, and that she is old, very old. I've even heard that she was present when Dagda carved the very first giant from the side of the mountain." "Did you say living stones?" "That's what they're called. I'm not sure why." I glanced toward the murk, studded with dead trees and stagnant pools. A crane cried out in the distance. "Are you sure this creature will help us?" "No, but she might. That is, if she doesn't eat us first." I rocked back on my heels. "Eat us?" "The legends say she is always hungry and fiercer than a cornered giant." Trouble cocked his head toward Rhea. He piped a low, long whistle. She lifted her eyebrows. What's wrong? Trouble promises to keep us safe, but this is the first time I've heard that note of worry in his voice. I sniffed. I feel sorry for the Grandaloosa if she should try to eat Trouble. This bird doesn't know the meaning of fear. That's why I'm not happy to hear him sounding worried. With that, she turned again to the swamp. She stepped on a slab of caked mud, from which she leaped to a rock. As I followed, I noticed we had left our footprints in the mud, but dismissed any concern about leaving tracks. We were already so deep in the forest it could not matter. We hopped from rock to rock again, making our way slowly across the swamp. Snags reached out to us with long, withered arms. Strange voices, somehow different from birds or frogs, echoed across the murky water, joining the occasional whistle from Trouble. Often, as we struggled to keep to the shallower places, something would slap the surface of the water or seem to stir within its darkened depths. I could never quite tell what might be causing such disturbances, nor did I really want to know. At length, the swamp faded, even as gray mist began to thicken the air. We came to a wet field of tall grasses, which gradually lifted into solid ground. Ahead of us stood a steep, rock-strewn hill, where vaporous arms unfurled toward us. Rhea halted. The Misted Hills! If only I could find a cluster of sweet berries. We could use an extra dose of strength for the climb. She glanced at me uncertainly, and for whatever else lies ahead. As we started to ascend, Trouble lifted off from my shoulder. He flew in silence, making slow, stately circles in the air above our heads. Although I guessed he was scanning the forest for any sign of danger, he also seemed to be enjoying himself, savoring the freedom of soaring on high. Boulders, some as big as Rhea's whole house, appeared here and there among the trees. The trees themselves grew farther and farther apart, their gnarled roots grasping the hillside. Yet despite the greater distance between the trunks, the forest didn't seem any lighter. Maybe it was the shadows of the immense boulders, or the curling mist surrounding them, or something else. But the forest felt increasingly dark. As we labored to climb the steep slope, doubts flowed over me like the mist. Whatever kind of being this Grandaloosa was, she certainly didn't pick such a place to live because she enjoyed having visitors. And what if the goblins in the forest found us first? I clutched the Galator beneath my tunic, but I did not feel any better. Suddenly, a great gray stone loomed directly before me. I froze. Perhaps it was only a trick of the mist, confusing my second sight, but it looked less like a boulder than a face, craggy and mysterious. A face staring straight at me. Then I heard, or thought I heard, a grinding sound, almost like someone clearing his throat. The boulder seemed to shift its weight ever so slightly. I didn't wait to learn what happened next. Up the hill I raced, tripping over roots, rocks, and my own feet. At last I topped the rise. Above my panting, I heard an angry buzzing sound. Bees. Thousands of bees, swarming around the broken trunk of a dead tree. Although it was hard to be certain in the mist, it looked as if the tree had broken off, probably in a storm not long ago. What was not hard to tell was that the bees were not pleased about it. Rhea placed her hands on her hips, watching the furious buzzing with interest. Reading her thoughts, I shook my head. "You're not thinking," I panted, "about going after their honey, are you?" She grinned slyly. "A person can never get enough honey. It would take just a minute to fetch some. It wouldn't slow us down." "You can't! Look at all those bees!" Just then, Trouble dropped down, enjoying a final flying swoop before landing on my shoulder. This bird clearly loved to fly. As he settled in, he gave a satisfied chirp. I felt surprised at just how familiar, almost natural, it felt to have him there. So different from yesterday. He folded his banded wings upon his back, cocking his head toward me. On a whim, I winked at him. Trouble winked back. Rhea continued to examine the broken trunk. If only I could find some way to distract the bees, just for a few seconds. That would be enough. With a sudden screech, Trouble took off again. He flew straight into the swarm. He swooped and dived among the bees, batting them with his wings, then raced away into the mist. The swarm sped after him. "Madness! That bird likes to fight as much as you like." I didn't bother to finish, since Rhea was already scaling the severed trunk in search of the bee's stores of honey. I listened for any buzzing, but heard none. I ran to join her. As I pulled myself up on a low branch, the trunk cracked and wobbled unsteadily on its base. "Careful, Rhea," I called. "This whole thing could topple over at any time." But she could not hear. Fully occupied, she was already leaning over the jagged top of the trunk. Standing on the branch, I leaned over beside her. A golden pool of honey, surrounded by walls of honeycomb as thick as my chest, lay beneath us. Bits of broken branches, bark, and honeycomb floated in the heavy syrup. I plunged in my hand, scooped out a heaping handful, then drank the sweet, gooey liquid. I had never in my life tasted such satisfying honey. Rhea apparently agreed, since she was busy feasting with both hands at once, her cheeks and chin dripping. "We should go," she declared at last. "Have your last swallow." Seeing a large chunk of honeycomb floating just below me, I grabbed it. As I tugged, however, the honeycomb refused to budge. Bracing myself, I pinched it as hard as I could and yanked it with all my might. At that instant, the object rose out of the pool with a deafening howl. I suddenly realized that I had not been holding a honeycomb, but the tip of a huge, bulbous nose. Rhea shrieked as I jerked sideways to get away from the head, covered with honey, that was lifting toward us. Just then, the base of the thick trunk cracked, tilted, and split apart. It toppled over the side of the hill, taking both of us with it. Okay, that was the end of chapter 19. So tomorrow we will read chapter 20 called Shimp. Thank you for joining me. Have a great night. Good night.